welcome to you as we are now in the 22nd week of what we rather strangely call ordinary time in the liturgical cycles. Welcome to Lisa, back to us from Massey, Palmerston North. Grace, first time with us, lovely to have you, from Garrett Theological Seminary, where you're doing a master's in Chicago. Yep. And James from our very own Otago theological program of theology, whatever it is. Great to have the three of you on board. And let's talk about move up higher, my friend, because we do tend sometimes to sit at the wrong place at the table. James.
Yes, so I've got a few thoughts here on Luke 14:7 and following. Now, the reading for Sunday begins with verse 1. So you'll notice if you're looking closely at the lectionary that there's a whole story missing. And it's a story of one of the Sabbath controversies, which is the healing of the man with dropsy or edema. And there is a connection between that and the parable that follows. The connection is that in the ancient world, sometimes dropsy or edema was thought of as was used as a metaphor for avarice. So there's something going on in the story about friend move up higher. And the dinner that Jesus has been invited to, that is about greed and how to deal with human greed. Now, there's something else that's worth noticing about this passage, which is not often emphasized, because Luke is often thought of as the gospel of the poor. There's great emphasis on God's preference for the poor in Luke's gospel, which is in line with an awful lot of what we see in the Old Testament. What's often forgotten is that Luke Acts was addressed to a rich patron. Jesus in the gospel and Luke as the author of the gospel are addressing the rich and confronting them with their responsibilities. And of course, as we read Luke's gospel in other contexts, then other themes emerge and other addressees come to the fore as they hear the gospel. But essentially, this is a gospel that's addressed to the rich. And it is, of course, about turning human expectations and human social conventions upside down and confronting people with deep-seated selfishness and greed and sense of wanting to be honored and to determine their own place in the scheme of things. The following story is about the great banquet, the banquet at the end of time, at what the gospel calls the resurrection of the righteous. And so this is also a story that points forward to the values that will be embodied in the great eschatological banquet in the kingdom. I think maybe I'll leave it for there. Leave it there for now.
Thank you, James, and that's a lot to go on with, and that's lovely. So, Grace, let's come to you. When you read this passage, none of us can be but challenged, I feel.
I agree. The challenge for me is something to do with who we view as sort of the protagonist of this story. I think oftentimes when we listen to parables, there's a character that we feel we are to identify with, the main character, if you will. And as you were saying, this story was written to a rich patron. The protagonist in this story is the wealthy host of the feast. And so there is a natural inclination for us as readers to assume we also are the wealthy, powerful host. My challenge would be, what if that's not the character we're supposed to identify with in this story? It's much more comfortable for us to imagine that we are the host. That's not only the main character, but that's a character who has privilege and authority. It's much more uncomfortable to imagine that we are the guests, especially from this last note of the story, those ones that cannot possibly give anything in return. It's very uncomfortable to think we might be those sort of wretched guests from the bottom rungs of society, but maybe that is in that challenge to see ourselves in that light. That's where more wisdom can be found.
Well, there you are. Thank you. And let's go to you, Lisa, because I think Grace has thrown a gauntlet to us all. Let's see where your challenge is.
Well, I was struck by the first line, which I think gives us a kind of perspective perspective on the rest of it, that Jesus has been invited and it was being carefully watched. And I think the Pharisees had invited him so that they could watch him and assess him and measure him. And their eyes weren't open to the wonder and the learning that he could provide them. And so for me, the challenge is, how often do we stand back and judge, staying in our own place of power rather than being opened up to new perspectives and new learning and new joy?
So I've heard, interestingly, two different perspectives here. I've heard one about sort of entitlement, and Grace has thrown to us, funnily enough, and aptly enough, given your name, a whole area of grace, of being at the bottom and not deserving to receive. James, can we come back to you? There's a bit of a challenge here in just navigating this.
Yeah, I think a major part of the challenge for me when I read this is, what are the kind of hidden assumptions that dictate the way that anybody relates to other people in the context in which we move. I remember a church I used to worship at in Manchester, where when the church had originally been built, there were different entrances, one for the rich and one for the poor. And it was a very socially stratified society. The upper crust of society, there was a sort of social glue. There were norms of behavior and norms of reciprocity and all of that. The challenge, I think, is to look deep inside and think, well, actually, what are the things in me? What are the things that have warped my ego that determine the ways that I look falsely at other people and pass judgment on them instinctively? And what do I need to be healed of in all of that in order to grow into the likeness of Christ?
That's exposing us to a kind of searing light, isn't it, of self-knowledge. And I could feel quite challenged and maybe potentially depressed. So, Lisa, cheer me up. Tell me there's some good news here.
There is good news here. Often Jesus' advice is hard to follow, but this is advice that we can all take. And I think it takes us away from the hospitality as a tit for tat, away from the transactional approach to living, which prevails in our neoliberal society, which says, if I give you this, you must give me this. So that even giving becomes a power play. This is about being a gift yourself. This is about opening yourself up. This is about letting yourself go. And it's practical advice that we can follow.
Well, you've given me some hope, but I'm still challenged, and I see good news there, I think. James.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about the freedom of God's grace, I think. I was reminded as I read this of the book of Job, and how the book of Job starts with the question of whether Job worships God, whether he fears God, without hope of getting something in return. And the entire book, read in a certain way, dismantles all of the assumptions that people have that life is based on a tit for tat, that it's based on reciprocity. There are contexts in which that reciprocity is extremely important, but there is a freedom here, a freedom, first of all, to be released from the things that bind us, but then also God's freedom. God makes us free, but also we are shown how God isn't bound into the assumptions that we have about reciprocity either. God turns the assumptions of our world on their heads. The resurrection of the righteous will be a place of great surprise, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And look, I'm hearing, I hope I haven't cut you off there.
No.
But I'm hearing that lovely phrase, and I've forgotten which the poet is, that talks about wild grace from God's wild grace. So, Grace, can you talk to me about where this good news is?
Absolutely. It was Lisa who brought up sort of that transactionality that we are trying to be freed of and that we are freed of through God. And that is the good news that I see in this, again, in those final moments, final lines of this parable where Jesus reminds to go out and invite in the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind, knowing that they cannot possibly repay. And if we are willing to view ourselves as those people, then we are freed from the fear of having to try to pay that back. We don't have to live with that hanging cloud of tit for tat.
That's an amazing way of being set free, because I think we often want some sort of reciprocity for us. Even if we're at the bottom of the heap, we want to be able, what can I do for you? And I'm hearing clearly from all of you now, I can't do anything back for God, who's a figure in this parable. So let's then go to so what. We're disempowered from any leverage here, I think, but we can't leave a God. We can't tell God who to choose. But Lisa, where do you find an application?
Yeah, I guess because I see this passage as about giving ourselves away and escaping from that critical, judgmental, what's in it for me mentality. The so what is, how do we free ourselves from that? And how do we step into joy? Because it's all here in front of us. And I think if we can let go of sitting in the church pews, it's not doing it for me. If we can let go of that and let God in, there is so much joy to be had. That the banquet is such a rich image, and we're invited to be there.
I'm fascinated that we're not following either a capitalist or a socialist line here. We're going for this mad, wonderful, generous God who brings joy. I think this rather emboldening in some ways. James, tell me an application now.
The application is that we are free to know and believe and trust that God loves us utterly, freely. That is the most extraordinary truth. That's the most extraordinary thing. There's so much in our lives, in too many people's lives, that tells us that we're not worthy, that we're not loved, or that we can come to fear that. But the God of this story is one who loves all of us utterly.
I find that kind of a wow factor. I think is about the only phrase that I've got left. So Grace, you'll have to wrap up for me, because this is just overpoweringly encouraging now.
To me, the application of this story is about humility on a meta level. Not only is this a story to the Pharisees, chastising them to be humble, but for us, it is a reminder that humility is not a show that we put on. Humility is what we do as guests. And if we are able to live as guests with a mentality of a guest, someone who has been invited in, we stop trying to prove ourselves in little ways and we can appreciate the gifts that we receive.
Well, this has been an inspirational conversation. I think I'm going to leave it at that. It's just been lovely having you breaking open this powerful passage and leaving a huge sense of encouragement. So, James, Lisa, Grace, thanks so much for digging deep on this one, right into the emotions. Thank you very, very much.